Hello, everybody, boys and girls, those who bounce in between. It's Comrade Dankey here today with our special friend and guest star F.V.K. 1917.
Hey, what's up, comrades?
And in today's video, I thought we could talk a little bit about the sort of stigmatization of Marxist Leninism and of Stalin and Mao and all that stuff, and how that, for a lot of people, is pretty much the number one barrier in approaching socialism. Because when they talk about socialism, usually they associate it with repression and totalitarianism and breadlines and cruelty and mass executions. And the Western media, the bourgeois media, has been very successful in funding that idea and pushing that idea on people. Even in the left, they peddle these kinds of ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. Me and Dankey were just talking here a second ago. That was definitely one of the things that was a big hurdle in the beginning for us. Getting exposed to Marxism, that is one of the first things that you're going to have to deal with over and over. Well, what about Stalin? Things like that. So we're just hoping to clear up a little bit, what's true and what's not. A lot of the rumors around Stalin, something that I learned was that even mainstream historians don't have a clear view of what happened under that period. A lot of videos and a lot of people, when they talk about Stalin, they act as if this is a historical fact and it's just been settled. But when you see mainstream historians from the Cold War versus now disagreeing on major pieces of information, it at least has to make you call into question, how much of Stalin's rule do we know that, how much of that is true and what's not?
Yeah, especially since the Soviet secret archives opened up after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in the 90s. And so you had Western scholars and academics rushing in, reading these archives, and they found something very strange, that these Soviet leaders, Stalin and Lenin and the like, weren't these weird, evil, conspiring goons who were trying to, weasel their way into a point of influence, but they genuinely had a concern for the working class, and they genuinely had a concern for the issues of imperialism and how to actually build socialism. In other words, they were legit.
Yeah, I remember hearing Stephen Kotkin talk, anti-communist historian, and he was asked, well, why did Stalin do all these things? And I think his answer was something along the lines of, well, because he was a communist. And his explanation was that everybody thought that behind the scenes, when these guys were just like behind closed doors, they wouldn't be talking about the proletariat anymore. They wouldn't care about class struggle. That was just something just to win the workers over and act like they had an ideology. But like Dankey said, whenever those archives got open, this is obviously something they believed and something they believed that they were doing correctly.
Yeah, and one of the biggest, things you first hear about when you try to convince somebody to read about socialism is they'll usually hit you with, well, the Soviet Union, didn't Stalin kill millions and millions of people? And you hear this number thrown around all the time. Stalin killed millions of people. Sometimes the number changes. Sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less. I've heard as much as, oh, let's see. I've heard Stalin killed 170 million people. I think is the highest I've heard.
Yeah, and obviously that number has dropped significantly. If anybody wants to put out a book or anything anymore, you can't be just saying something that untrue. Now, it's generally somewhere about between like 7 and 9 million. Generally, you'll hear something like that. But my thing has always been, I mean, we never look back at these, presidents in the past, like George Washington or people, and are like, oh well, he was fine, but he has this X amount of numbers on his conscience because he killed this many people.
Yeah.
We don't really do that with anybody except for like these socialist leaders. I mean, yeah, you hear people saying that if you're saying like, oh yeah, George Bush, during he caused this war, so there's he's responsible for this many deaths. That is reasonable, but that's not a trend that you really see starting until, like, these Cold War books are coming out about these past Soviet leaders.
Yeah, and I mean, one thing I want to stress more than anything else is that we don't make apologies for what happened. We don't deny that mistakes were made in the Soviet Union and Mao's China. We don't think that these systems were perfect. We don't think that these regimes were perfect, and we criticize them, but we do so constructively because we're trying to figure out what their successes were, what their mistakes were, and we are trying to learn. In other words, you have to study the failures and the successes of these regimes, and study it from an objective point of view in order to actually learn how to go forward.
Yeah, and one of the most tiring things, especially when you are a Marxist Leninist, is having to go over just these simple things that are, they may not be totally clear, like what happened during the Holodomor, what happened during the Great Purges. But when you hear people just so off from, like, anywhere based in reality, you got to just question how much reading they've done into this or how much time they put into it. I personally have seen how much work it takes and how much studying it takes, and I don't even claim to be anywhere. I'm not a Soviet expert or anything like that by any mile. So it does take a lot of work and a lot of research. So it's just questionable, when you're debating people, anarchists or anti-communists, that they've done similar amounts of, like, research on these questions. But they're always so confident in like, that these are historical facts that have just been settled already.
Yeah, and I mean, this always seems to be like the big hurdle for Marxist Leninists. This seems to be like where the pedal really does meet the metal, and some people just throw their hands up and they're like, you know what, it's too much for me. I'm not going to try to defend Stalin. I'm not going to try to defend Mao or North Korea or Venezuela or any of these other socialist regimes. It's just too hard for me. Um, and to those people, I have to say, you really have to take into consideration the historical time periods where these regimes took place, uh, and you have to consider the material conditions that they're under, these socialist regimes, past and present, and you also have to consider, most importantly, consider your sources when you're looking at information about these regimes. Who is telling you this information and who's funding them? It can make the difference.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Robert Conquest is a classic example. Wrote The Great Terror, Harvester of Sorrow. Several other anti-communist books, and he was funded by the British government along with several other journalists. This is something that you see, very common amongst a lot of these anti-communist authors. Something that I would like to get out of more discussion on Stalin and Mao and these periods. I hope that we can get to a point where it's a more nuanced discussion. Because where it's at right now is it's pretty poor. You have one side who is really trying to dedicate themselves to learning about these things, and another who just constantly tries to get you with gotchas, where there's definitely room for a more nuanced conversation in there.
Yeah, it really does turn into just an instant case of gotcha questions being slung at you, and it's kind of frustrating. It is a struggle to be a Marxist Leninist because you pretty much have to be a walking encyclopedia. You have to be able to answer questions about, the Chinese Revolution, the Russian Revolution, uh, the Spanish Civil War, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, all of these other communist regimes like Cuba and Venezuela, and it just goes on and on and on. And it's you can tell that the people who are asking these questions, the people that say, well, what about Venezuela? They don't really give two flying shits about Venezuela, but they know to ask that question as sort of a gotcha question. It's been programmed into them.
Yeah, the Venezuela thing has almost become a nervous tick at this point.
Yeah, it's pretty obnoxious. I mean, I've made videos on the past about Venezuela. If you're interested in that, you can check them out. There's many videos explaining the whole imperialist narrative on Venezuela and why that's bullshit. Um, but the point is that you hear these arguments from the right wing, but you also hear them consistently from the left, from social democrats who love to call themselves socialist, but they will shove all past and presently existing socialist regimes under the bus, denounce them as authoritarians and whatnot, and they buy completely in to all this bourgeois propaganda. But then also the anarchists who can't wait. They're almost frothing at the mouth to parrot the same right wing sources like William Randolph Hearst and Robert Conquest, who denounce Stalin and denounce everything done by the USSR and all these communist regimes. And it's just really disappointing to see how intellectually bankrupt so many, quote unquote leftists are in this day and age, especially in the online community.
Yeah. So, how did you, start discovering this? Like, a little more of the truth about the Stalin era and such.
Well, I just wanted to get more of a sense on what Marxist Leninism actually was. So I just started reading books by Stalin, and I read Foundations of Leninism, and that kind of woke me up. I realized Stalin wasn't just some crazy fucking psycho. He wasn't frothing at the mouth just killing people left and right, but this guy was actually, smart. He's a big brain boy, and he was able to put together uh, very concisely pretty much a guide on what is Leninism, the foundations of it. And I just read more and more about how the so-called figures about the Holodomor and all of these you know figures about the Great Purges and all that stuff was just complete and total horseshit. I grew up reading Stalin, Man of Steel. I forgot who wrote that book.
I can't remember. I know I read that one though too.
Yeah, but it's hilarious. I'll link it in the description.
Yeah.
But the guy who wrote it, he describes Stalin as like this frothing at the mouth madman who was everybody was just pissing their pants and afraid of him, and it was just by sheer force of fear. It's like a very Machiavellian figure. It was like through sheer force of just fear and intimidation, Stalin like held the people of Russia, the people of the USSR hostage.
Yeah, I made a similar mistake early on in our school library. I just started reading a bunch of old literature about like the Soviet Union, and of course most of it was anti-communist. This would have been like beginning of like 2019, and I went through like Stalin, Man of Steel, several of these books, and basically you come out with the impression that he was very paranoid, had some type of mental like issue where he just couldn't trust anybody, and was a sex crazed maniac. That was surprisingly something that came up quite often. Just anything there is just to discredit these people. But honestly, I was left a little more confused when I would walk away from these books. I was never really satisfied with like, oh, what happened during the Great Purge? Just hearing that like this guy was insane and killed people wasn't enough. I don't know. I feel like if I read a book about Hitler and it was like, oh, he was just a madman and that's all there was. He just was crazy and evil. That wouldn't be really satisfying either. There's always some type of material condition, something like that. Even if the person is crazy, there's something more going on than that. And yeah, for me, it wasn't until like I picked up like books by Grover Furr and stuff like that, I was just shocked. It was just like clear as day. Actually reading through these documents or seeing sections of them, like the old Soviet documents, it paints a very different story than what we've been hearing for this whole time.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's important to know that there are tons of authors and writers and speakers out there who have researched this stuff. F.V.K mentioned Grover Furr. He's an excellent source. But what are some other good sources you could look to? I know for me, probably the one I tell everybody to go to is a podcast called Revolutionary Left Radio, and they did a special on Stalin, and it was very well researched, and it was delivered almost like a dissertation. It cited tons and tons of sources. So if you're really interested into diving in the meat and potatoes of just how the bourgeois media has butchered Stalin and misrepresented him to everybody in the West, check that podcast out. But there are also just tons of authors who have talked about this as well.
Yeah, and I know on that episode, Pearls of the Round Table podcast was on there, and they have a couple of episodes of Stalin that are really good as well. I don't know the authors, but there's a book called Another View of Stalin that came out in like the late 90s. That's a great source. There's one called Fraud, Famine, and Fascism from like the late 80s. That's another great one if you want to learn about like the Holodomor. I'm sure there's like several other ones though.
Yeah, we'll link as many of these as we can find in the description, because we want people to find these sources and read up on this themselves. Don't just take our word for it, but find out the truth for yourselves. And I think a lot of you would be shocked just at the sheer amount of bullshit and wool that has been pulled over all of our eyes about all of these regimes.
And even if you come away still believing that Stalin did terrible things and such, at least you would have a more, critical argument and could meet us on a different level than just like, oh, he was just a terrible person and that was it. So yeah, even from like an anti-communist side, that will help your argument. Just learning what are we reading, what are we actually like, where do we get these ideas from? Because otherwise, like we're just going to be, like passing each other like two ships in the night or whatever.
And I think that pretty much says it all. We've said our piece, but in short, to sum it up, the reputation of Stalin, of Mao, the USSR, and China, all of these regimes, it's usually the first thing that gets thrown at us in terms of a criticism. People usually say, well, what about, Stalin? Didn't he kill millions of people? And usually we are stuck having to have a little history lesson, having to explain how all this stuff is really bullshit, how the Holodomor is bullshit, and the Great Purge really wasn't that bad, and it was absolutely necessary, and then it really just kind of bogs the conversation down. Instead of discussing the core ideas, instead of discussing what socialism actually is, you're having a discussion about what a certain socialist party did back in the 1920s or 1930s.
Yeah, basically.
But anyway, that's that. I highly recommend everybody read up on these sources and check it out. Reading Rainbow.